Hello, everyone. My name is Inés Katzenstein. I'm curator of Latin American art and director of the Cisneros Institute at MoMA. And I'm also curator of the exhibition Sur Moderno, Journeys of Abstraction, a show that I organize with Maria Garcia. As you can tell, I'm not at the museum and I am live streaming from my home in Brooklyn. And I'm very happy to be joined by Gabriel Perez-Barreiro, a longtime friend and senior advisor of the Cisneros collection. Hi, Gabriel.
Hey, Inés.
We deeply regret that we can't welcome you in the galleries during this health crisis, but we're very happy to bring the art that we care about to you at home with these 8 virtual views. The focus of tonight's conversation will be Sur Moderno, an exhibition that celebrates a transformative donation that trustee Patricia Phelps de Cisneros gave to the museum in 2016. The show, which was inaugurated with the reopening of MoMA last October, includes around 90 works from artists working in South America between 1940 and 1970s in the language of geometric abstraction. While the museum is closed to the public, you can read about this topic in the catalog of Sur Moderno, which I have here, which includes essays by leading scholars in the field. But before starting my conversation, I want to offer a special welcome to our vibrant community of MoMA members and donors. We appreciate your support at this critical time, and we are so glad that you're here with us tonight. I wanted to offer a special thank you to Agnes Gand, the Diane and Bruce Halley Foundation, as well as to Adriana Cisneros de Griffin and Nicholas Griffin, and our annual exhibition fund donors. If you're not already a member of the Museum of Modern Art, please consider joining. You can do this online at moma.org/join. We have received many great questions about Sur Moderno over the last few days, and we also encourage you to submit your questions to us live. You can do this in the YouTube chat feature next to the video, either to the right or below the video, depending on your device, or you can send questions via email to membership@moma.org. So Gabriel, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This is truly a pleasure to have a conversation with you. And I would like to begin chatting by diving straight into the art. And I think that for a large part of MoMA audience, the works exhibited in Sur Moderno are a big surprise. And I think so for 2 reasons. On the one hand, these are works that are abstract, and they don't seem to refer to any specific context, be it physical or political. And on the other hand, these are works that expand the investigations of European artists working in abstraction in the early 20th century in very unexpected ways. And I would like to begin addressing this specific issue. And the question to you, Gabriel, would be, what are the specific contributions of this group of South American artists to the history of abstraction?
Well, first of all, Inés, thank you so much for the invitation to talk about one of my favorite topics and to be able to, share these ideas in this format. So I think you're right. You used the word surprising, and I think that's exactly what this exhibition, I imagine, is to many of the audience. And I think one of the reasons is that when you hear the words geometric abstraction, I think you tend to think of something that is sort of dry, formal, a kind of art for art's sake, sort of within the language of minimalism, which I think is wider known to MoMA's audience. And I think when you walk into this exhibition that you so beautifully curated, I think the first thing that hits you is a sense of energy, is a sense that these are works that are trying to tell you something, they're trying to engage you, they're trying to seduce you, they're playful, they're seductive, they're sexy, they want to be manipulated, they want to be touched. So there's kind of an energy in that room and in this period that I think is very different from the sort of stereotypical view we have of geometric abstraction. I think on top of that, as you mentioned, we also have a stereotype of Latin America. Anytime we see Latin America in the news, there's something terrible is happening. There's a disaster, there's a political disaster, a natural disaster. So for many people, it's a word that tends to sort of pull downwards. And I think what we see in this exhibition is a period when Latin America was this kind of beacon of hope, of progress, of developmentalism, of construction. And that's not an idea that we're particularly kind of used to. And there's a historical reason for that. These are works, this is the post-war period. So Latin America was saved, the carnage and destruction that happened in Europe and parts of Asia. It was relatively stable, relatively wealthy. And so these post-war years were kind of a period of great optimism, at least until the sort of 60s, 70s when things changed a little bit. And then I think a third aspect in the surprise is that in the sort of North American MoMA before its current reincarnation version of history, post-war abstraction was abstract expressionism, was gestural abstraction, where the kind of spirit we have is a very individualist spirit. It's a very tortured, kind of macho, individualistic ethos. And that's very different from what we see in the show. We see works that are talking about society, that are talking about sort of progress, that have a very optimistic and collective view. So I think, again, there's this kind of dislocation. This is a bit of history that we sort of need to know more about. And I would add one little tiny point just because it's fun to do so, which is that there's more women in this show than I think we're used to seeing in exhibitions of this period of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And that's because many of the leading artists of these movements, I think Ligia Clark, Ligia Papi, Maria Freire, I mean, Gego, there are so many artists who are women who are recognized fairly early on in their careers and have been recognized. So I think that there's a number of ways in that I think this beautiful exhibition can be surprising. It's that sense of spirit that I think is different.
Perhaps to give an example of the type of cultural specificity of these artists, you can talk about Joaquín Torres Garcia, perhaps, who's a very paradigmatic example of the type of itinerary of some of these artists, including a full immersion in European avant-garde groups on the one hand, but on the other hand, a very clear interest in negotiating those experiences with specific South American backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. So I don't know if you want to talk about, for example, this construction.
Sure, I'd love to. So Torres Garcia is sort of the outlier, but also the origin of much of the story that's told in the exhibition. The outlier because he was much older. So this is an artist who was born in Uruguay, and at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, he moved to Spain. He was in Barcelona, then he moved to Paris, he moved to New York. This is someone who was in motion, sort of perpetual motion, all of his life. And in those movements, he was very engaged with the European avant-garde. So he worked alongside Mondrian, along the artists of Abstraction, Colección in Paris. Picasso, he was a member of that avant-garde. He knew it firsthand. And what happened is that as he was within those groups, he kind of questioned that hard edge orthodoxy of abstraction, of something like the De Stijl movement or neoplasticism, which he felt was too rigid, was too reductive. And the vision that he had for an abstract art, and we can see it in this piece, was something that was expansive, something that was sort of deeply humanist. So he was a great researcher, a great thinker, a great writer. That's something we'll come back to, this idea of the artists who also write and articulate their theories. And he studied ancient Egyptian art, African art, and of course pre-Columbian art, which he felt a particular connection to because of his South American origins. So when we see a painting like the one you just showed, the black and white construction, we see a work that on the one hand is completely geometric, but on the other, it sort of recalls Incan stonework, for example. It feels like it is speaking to an ancient civilization. And so for Torres Garcia, those two things were not incompatible. He didn't see modernity as a kind of blank slate from which to start from zero, which many of the other artists in the show did. He was someone who thought modernity was a way that we could kind of look back and understand and incorporate and create what he called constructive universalism. So a language of abstraction that incorporated spirituality, that incorporated other cultures, that incorporated a sense of spiritual geometry, that was more about sort of adding and aggregating content than stripping it down to its bare essentials.
And another artist that I see personally as another type of outlier is Lidia Pape, who is one of the first artists that you encounter when you enter in Sur Moderno, and her amazing book of creation. And I see this work as an outlier, but perhaps I'm wrong, because it's clearly a geometric work, but it's a work that has incredible metaphysical connotations. Each of its parts has a specific meaning in relationship to the origin of the world. Would you like to talk about it a little bit?
I'd love to. This is actually one of my favorite works in the entire history of art. And so it's always such a joy to see it. So as you say, this is a work that to me sort of exemplifies a lot of the best of this period of history and of this exhibition, and of course of this collection and this gift, which is the ability to take a very simple language and to say very complex and very evocative things with it. So this work, when you first see it, it's pure geometric form. And in fact, we're seeing it mounted, but originally this would have just been a pile of flat pieces of cardboard.
Yes, because it's a book.
It's a book. And so the idea is that this would be an interactive piece. So the artist would sit with somebody in front of them and they would assemble these pages. And as she would assemble these pages, you see some of them spin, some of them have little pop-up books. It's kind of like today's children's pop-up books. You know, it's an interactive sculpture in the form of a book. And there's a story, as you mentioned, that goes with this book. And so if we start from left to right, as you look at the screen, the earth is covered with water, the water recedes, and we literally see that happening in geometric shapes. Then plants grow, then hunting, then seeds are sown, then it's agriculture, the discovery of the solar system, shelter, fire, and then that final page, which is the yellow sheet with an empty white square, is light. So it's kind of the story of the world reaching to light. It's an absolutely beautiful sort of metaphor of creation. And of course, there's two kinds of creation. There's a creation of the universe, and then there's a creative act of us as people. And so that sense of sort of telling a big story, but bringing it right down to the personal, to a conversation that you and I could be having with this object between us, that we would be touching at the same time and telling each other stories about it. That's the sense where I think that it's the geometry that's not about reducing. It's not about trying to make some pure absolute statement about the origin of the world. It's trying to make it as rich and evocative as possible. And there's a beautiful phrase that the Brazilian art critic Mario Pedrosa used, which was the experimental exercise of freedom. Yeah. And I think that a work like this just seems to me to encompass that so beautifully. You know, there's the sense of not feeling tied into the orthodoxy of geometry, but being able to use it to express all kinds of very poetic and very expansive ideas.
And the first part of the show tries to focus very much on this idea of experimentation, and specifically in the way these artists try to reinvent the art object through different material procedures. And in the case of the Brazilian artists, many of the works on view are the results of processes of folding, cutting, extending a plane into 3 dimensions, like in this Amilcar de Castro. In many others, the works invite viewers to manipulate them, radically reconfiguring the relationship between viewer and object, like in this Lydia Clark. In the case of the Venezuelan artists who were focusing so much on the possibility of producing optical effects that produce an incredible experimentation on the actual physicality of the objects. And last but not least, the Argentines and the Uruguayan artists that developed the so-called cutout frame, abandoning the idea of the traditional rectangular frame of a painting. But what I would like to discuss with you is in what ways, Gabriel, these formal experimentations also related to political ideas that were so important for some of these artists.
So again, I think that's one of the big surprises of this show, is that we're used to thinking of abstraction, geometric abstraction, as either apolitical or spiritual. You know, remember that, you know, Mondrian was interested in ideas of theosophy, Hilma af Klint, you know, had her own sort of spiritual world. So that's kind of, in many ways, kind of the mainstream of this. Almost every artist in this exhibition was an artist on the I'd say the left to the far left, sometimes the extreme far left. And almost all of them justified their art in terms of a sort of revolutionary social project. So for them, abstraction was a way to break down the conventions of traditional art. So if traditional art was of the bourgeoisie, if it was about religion, if it reflected the ruling class, you know, all of these kinds of ideas of what art was, abstraction was a way of kind of short-circuiting that, of speaking a universal language. And one of the ways we know this, and that's so important to understand, I think, this exhibitionist period, is that almost all of these artists wrote manifestos, published magazines. There's a massive sort of provocative manifesto type context to these works. So very few people were happy to just produce the art and kind of let it be itself. You know, they really wanted to explain, like, no, I'm doing this because this is going to contribute to the revolution. This is going to make life better. This represents a better vision of society. That was a constant in almost every case we have. And I think that is something, again, that's very surprising to us. I mean, when I was a student, the sort of official line on abstraction in Latin America is that it was airport art, that it was something that was sort of decorative and apolitical and, you know, didn't mean anything. And there were even important critics like Marta Traba, it was an Argentine Colombian critic, you know, who thought abstraction was kind of cultural imperialism. Yeah. And then when you look at these artists and you read and you see what they were doing, it couldn't be further from the truth. These people were going very, very deep into ideas of activism and politics.
And this is especially true in the case of the Argentines, who were probably the most politically engaged of these groups. And I would like you to see if you can discuss a specific work of the Argentine group in this formal/political sense. For example, the work of Loza would be a good example.
Yeah, let's look at the work of Loza, because that's that piece really, it's almost like a visual manifesto of the artistic belief. So this piece was made in 1946, and when he was a member of a group that was called the Asociación de Arte Concreto Invención, the Association of Concrete Invention Art. Now, this group was organized almost like a trades union. To join the group, you had to sign a series of statutes, and the first item on the statutes was that you had to swear allegiance to the Soviet Union as the savior of humanity. I don't remember the exact words, but it's along those lines. You know, so that was before you got anywhere else. So it was a creed that started with politics, and then it went down and said, okay, therefore, our works cannot be signed. This work is not signed. They can have no individualistic traits. There's no brush work allowed. They have to look like they were made industrially. They cannot be in a rectangular frame, because the rectangular frame was invented in the Italian Renaissance. It's part of this whole structure that we're trying to overthrow. We have to make objects that can be utilitarian, that don't deceive people. So there was this kind of moral equivalence that they made between illusion and class and social class. They say that as long as art is trying to trick you that there is a reality behind the picture, it's the same lie as the capitalist telling you, you know, that work will make you free, or whatever that thing is. So they talk in these slightly, I mean, now we think it's kind of slightly nutty terms, but they were absolutely convinced, and they had these very formal meetings with all the paperwork, with the statutes they had to sign, they had to pay a membership fee, you know, and they took these things very, very seriously. And their magazines would include text by Lenin. There's one that even includes a text by Stalin. And the great irony of this is that we think of the Soviet Union in the mid-1940s. This was not a language that they were happy with. This is a period of socialist realism. Yeah. But somehow in this weird time-space bubble, these artists for a very short period are convinced that they're recovering that spirit of the Russian Revolution. So they're kind of building a bridge from Rodchenko, who's also in the exhibition, you know, right until sort of mid-40s Argentina. And then they sort of translate that into the fight against Perón. So it's a really fascinating and beautifully complicated, and we have many rabbit holes we can go down, but that's sort of like the big picture of it.
I would like to discuss another work in the show that I think is very interesting in terms of politics, which is the case of the Elioiticica Parangolé. Elioiticica is a very important Brazilian artist, and he created these capes to dance in the carnival. And these this cape, along with other pieces, was produced by the artist as part of his own experience in a popular neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the politics embedded in this object.
Absolutely. So I think what happens here is, from this first moment where we have artists sort of talking in a very traditional party political way, in their relationship to the Communist Party, by the 1960s, things are very different. And I think we start to define politics in very different ways. And it really becomes a politics of the body. It becomes a politics of expression. And in Oiticica's case, of his interest in the marginal cultures, the so-called marginal cultures of Rio. So the favelas. He was of a middle to upper middle class background, but he was fascinated with the cultures that were right, Rio, one of these cultures is right on top of the other. They're very close in physical proximity. So he began to frequent these neighborhoods and made many friends. And what he did, which is so interesting, is take that tradition and language of geometric abstraction to make a work like this, which is a cape. So it's a piece to wear. And he would work with the dancers in the samba schools. We have an example here on the left of a person called Nildo who would wear this. And the idea is that they would dance, they would move. So the sculpture had completely come off the wall. It was no longer anything that had anything to do with our sort of traditional European understanding of art. It was a body in motion. And this piece in particular is so interesting because you can't really see it on the slide, but that sash, the banner that goes across diagonally, says Diversidade vivemos, which in Portuguese means we live from adversity. And so there's also a kind of very specific ethic in there about survival. These were obviously a community that was very persecuted, and until today it still is. And that sense of how can we express a need for survival, a response to discrimination within the language of something that has evolved out of geometric abstraction. So that's what's so interesting, is how that political impulse gets renewed in that next generation in a very different, a very powerful way.
Gabriel, we're starting to receive questions from the audience. Howie asked, one of the galleries of Sur moderno shows modernist chairs, posters, and lots of photos of architecture and design works. Can you talk about the connection between those practices and the art included in Sur moderno? Oh, here we can see an image of the gallery that probably Howie is referring to, in which we included these pieces of furniture from Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil, and these vitrines in which we gather all these materials that basically are testimonies of this connection and alliance between the languages of geometric abstraction and design and architecture in the different cities. Gabriel, would you like to develop on the specificity of these connections?
Sure. I mean, I think that there is within this desire for the abstract art to be social somehow, design, architecture, the built environment is obviously an extension of that. It's a way that this language can sort of permeate and enter into everyday life. That's not to say it's not without its contradictions, because of course it is. Making these beautiful chairs is making a luxury object that will be commercialized within the rules of capitalism. So certain artists, for example, the Argentine artists had a much harder time sort of reconciling their work with industry in general and with the state particularly with the state that was more hostile. But what you see in Brazil and Venezuela is a dance, I'd say a sort of marriage dance, where the state, industry, and these artists really find an interesting ways to work together. And there are two very emblematic projects that you show very well in the exhibition. One, of course, is the construction of Brasilia as the new capital of Brazil, inaugurated in 1960, away from the colonial capital of Rio, which of course is a beautiful, exuberant, but very old city, to this modernist paradigm designed by Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa. And the other project would be the University City in Caracas, Venezuela, designed by Villanueva, where there is a constant integration of the major modern artists of the day. For example, the image on the left, that's the largest work Alexander Korda ever produced, and it's in Caracas, Venezuela. It's still there until today. There's an art sculpture there, but there are also the whole new generation of Venezuelan artists who were emerging at this period. So Cruz Diaz, Soto, Otero are also included in there. So the way that these languages that start as being a very sort of countercultural movement really are embraced by the state, by industry. There's an entire hydroelectric dam in the middle of Venezuela that was designed by Carlos Cruz Diaz. So you start to get this really interesting confluence of what was a little minority group of slightly wacky artists, and that dovetails very well with nations that are on this big, expansive, developmentalist, industrializing project.
Gabriel, before opening to other questions from the audience, I would like us to focus a little bit on some institutional aspects of these movements, and specifically on questions of circulation and visibility. When you started studying these topics in the early 90s, and I believe as a PhD student in Essex University, you once told me that one of the triggers for this interest in Latin American abstraction was an exhibition of Julia Kosice in the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Buenos Aires in 1991, an exhibition that I also remember having seen at that time. But really back then, the topics of concrete and abstract Latin American art were quite obscure. I would say, at least in Argentina, almost an eccentricity. And there was like a very sustained but slow process during the 90s with some scholars and curators starting to work with these materials, and little by little these materials started having a wider recognition and international exposure, and today we can say that South American geometric abstraction has finally been recognized. We are at MoMA talking about this, and you know, at a certain point it became mainstream. What is the role of the Cisneros collection in this history? And specifically, I would like you to focus on the Cisneros collection's project of organizing traveling exhibitions of the collection throughout Latin America, the US, and Europe.
So you're absolutely right. There has been an incredible, for my generation, an absolute transformation, to the point where now I meet young scholars and they're like, oh, geometric abstraction, you know, like we became like the old geezers in the room, which in a way is exactly what we wanted. You know, we wanted to become sort of boring and mainstream and redundant. And so I think that in a way there's a sort of weird satisfaction to that. That comes with that. But to go to the role of the collection, the Cisneros collection, of course, was really fundamental. I think it accompanied, supported, and amplified all of these processes in a very, very important, and I think a very intelligent way. So I think to ask why it's interesting, we can go back a little bit to the Ciudad Universitaria, that image we were looking at before. That building is the building that Patty and Gustavo Cisneros would walk through, you know, when they were young. So I think that there's something about that spirit of a Latin America that is progressive, that is connected to the rest of the world, where you can see Coda art and young Venezuelan artists all in the same space. That vision of Latin America, I think, has been just the driving force between their sort of commitment. And this is a collection that in multiple ways articulates that vision. And I would say leading right up to this, this gift and this exhibition. And I think that one of the remarkable things about the collection is an understanding that the artworks are not just objects, they're not just things, but they're also cultural artifacts. They also tell stories. Yeah. And that both of those things are important. So the collection had, I think, two sort of really important lines of work. One was to build the collection itself, which is pretty unparalleled in terms of its comprehensiveness, in terms of the story it tells from Torres Garcia to Gego. You know, it's very complete. It's very well researched, working with, you know, very good advisors and scholars along the way. But just as important, I think, is all the programs that were attached to that. So this mission of raising awareness, so building partnerships with academia, working with universities, with different museums, a kind of activist. Always I say it's an activist collection. It's a collection with an agenda. And as many resources were spent on that agenda as were spent on acquiring the works. And I think that's a really important distinction. Another very important distinction, I think, is that they could have built a museum and it would have been an amazing museum. I mean, the Cisneros Museum would have gone from indigenous culture to contemporary art. It would have been amazing, but it would have been an isolated museum of Latin American art. And I think the vision they have of integrating, of expanding the canon, of having these artists be put into as many different conversations and dialogues as possible is why they didn't do that. So I think that choice was why from about 2000, so about 2000, the collection was pretty much mature, I would say. Most of the works in the show had been acquired by then. And so the first exhibition was at the Fogg Museum at Harvard, first time any Latin American work had hung in that museum. And that started a touring exhibition program that went down the east coast of Latin America, up the west coast of Latin America, to Peru, to Central America. It kind of went, very ambitious program. That ended with a show at the University of Texas called Geometry of Hope, which I was fortunate enough to curate. I was working in the museum at the time. And once the collection was kind of back, then we also started a number of partnerships with the Reina Sofia, with the Royal Academy in London, with the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, with Hunter College in New York, NYU. So this idea of sort of partnership and activation and the knowledge around the collection and scholarship was always very much at the heart of the project. So I think that's why it was able to be more than just like a collection of works. I think it actually became very much a player and a reference point for everyone who was working in this field.
And this brings us directly to my next question, which is about MoMA and this collection in MoMA. And since her first involvement with the museum in the late 70s, Patricia Cisneros has been a key figure in the museum in creating and supporting Latin American initiatives. Among other things, she created a travel grant that allowed like more than 100 staff members to travel to Latin America, which I think is amazing. She pushed for the creation of the position of a Latin American curator, which was covered by Paulo Herkenhoff first, and then Luis Perez Oramas. She was the founding chair of the Latin American and Caribbean Fund, which is a very active committee devoted to supporting the acquisitions of works from the region, which has acquired around 800 works since its creation in 2006. And among many other initiatives, really. But throughout those years, Patricia Cisneros has also consistently enriched the museum collection through donations, which culminated in 2016 when she donated 250 modern and contemporary works to the museum, accompanied with the creation of a research institute for Latin America. Can you share with us how this idea of the donation emerged?
Sure. And before saying that, just a little anecdote, but I think there's been such a massive sea change at MoMA. So when I was a student in England, MoMA was our bogeyman, like the one, every conference, the biggest target in the room was MoMA. And there was a very famous text by John Yao about the Wifredo land next to the Coke Jack. And, this was the stuff that we did. Today, I would say MoMA is one of the most important Latin American art museums in the world, and with all the complexity that statement has. And obviously, Patty's been a huge part of that. So, as you know, she's been a trustee for many years and is deeply committed to the museum on many, many fronts, with so many different programs, including endowing a librarian. I mean, many things that are sort of invisible, but that are very important to the life of the museum. So I think that she always knew that for this mission of having Latin American art be an expansive part of the canon, there's no better place than MoMA. There is no platform that is more important. There is no place that writes the history of art more assertively than MoMA does. So I think it took a long time for the museum to want it and to do that. I think when Glenn Lowry started as director, that was a very important turning point, and they've worked very closely in articulating that. And there are many moments to that history. In the last expansion, the one before this current one, John Elderfield, who was chief curator of painting and sculpture at the time, worked very closely with Luis Perez Oramas, your predecessor, in making a first gift that was fully integrated into the museum displays. And that was a real turning point. That was sort of the rehearsal for the much larger scale version of that, which we saw about a year ago when the museum reopened. So I think that there was a question of finding the timing. And then the really important part was this creation of the Research Institute, that it wasn't just about giving the works, it was about ensuring that there was not that there was, because there already is, but ensuring the maintenance of a lively discussion and engagement with Latin America, which there has really been for these last few years through CMAP and various other initiatives. So that really culminates with this project. Yeah.
We have a question from Juan Paolo Francisco, a MoMA volunteer, and also from Eric Lee. That is somehow very similar. So I'm going to read Juan Paolo, and he asks, could you please explain how Piet Mondrian influenced the South American abstract and concrete art? What is the thought process to include Broadway Boogie Boogie to this exhibition? Thank you.
Great, I love the question. So Mondrian is hugely important to the story that's told in Sur moderno. He was a constant reference point. In fact, a few years ago in Caracas, we organized a whole seminar on this topic, on sort of the readings and misreadings or rereadings of Mondrian in Europe, in North America, and in Latin America. And one thing we learned from that was that right from this period in the 1940s, Mondrian was in the center of the discussion. And for the Argentines, they thought he was a Marxist. The Brazilians thought he was a samba dancer. I mean, everyone read into his work what was their own interest. And that's fine. That's how art works. That's how culture works. That's how history works. So it's not a value judgment. It's actually what gives that real depth. And we learned something for me, so interesting in that talk. We had a speaker from the Pompidou who said that the Pompidou only acquired its first work by Mondrian in the 1980s. And she attributed that to Yves Saint Laurent and the Mondrian dress. So Mondrian was, and we forget this now because he's so iconic, but he was something of a marginal figure. And as you know, even when he was acquired at MoMA, it was not a slam dunk. That was a piece that has its own controversy. So the South Americans saw so much potential in Mondrian. He's so much part of that. There's a beautiful text by Ligia Clark where she says he's like the steak that you put on your black eye, to make you feel better. It's such an amazing metaphor for an artist like Mondrian. But that's how passionate they felt about him. So I think him being, the Broadway Boogie Woogie being in this show is such a moment of sort of poetic justice to recontextualize him very much as a Latin American artist, which I really think that he is. But I'd love to hear from you, Inés, how easy or hard was that negotiation to include one of the 5 top paintings in the museum in this exhibition?
For us, it was always from the beginning, we wanted to make of this exhibition an exhibition that would be specific for MoMA. So it's not only the Cisneros collection, but it's the Cisneros collection arriving into MoMA. So therefore, the idea of producing these dialogues between some works from MoMA collection and the South American artist was there from the beginning. And Mondrian, as you said, is a clear reference for all of these artists. And we have 2 options. We had the Broadway Boogie Boogie and an untitled painting, which was very important for Marita Garcia and for me, because it was reproduced in the Arturo magazine, which is this kind of like a seminal magazine or Bible for the Argentine artist. But we finally decided to go for the Broadway Boogie Boogie. And I have to say that the Department of Painting and Sculpture was absolutely generous with us. And they didn't have any doubt that the work had to be in Sur moderno. And the same in relationship to other pieces, such as the Rodchenko, that are pieces that have always been on view in MoMA, that are so identified with MoMA collection. And so I think this generosity of, yes, the idea is integrating these new arrived works with our collection was, very straightforward and fantastic. But one thing that I want to say is that for us, in the case of the Mondrian, for example, when you enter into that gallery, you don't see Mondrian at the center of the wall. You see Soto. And Mondrian is on the side wall. And my feeling is that for us it was very important to place Soto in the kind of center stage and Mondrian as a companion, because in a way, in this exhibition, Mondrian is companion of Soto as the central protagonist. So yeah, it was really fantastic and a complete privilege to be able to work with these pieces. And I have another question by Laura Lalinde, who's from Medellin, and she asked actually two questions. She says, seen from today, the utopian ideas of these movements are clearly something of the past. What happened with all that hope and trust in the project of development? And as a Colombian, she asked, and are there any works from Colombia in the show?
So let's take the first part of that. You know, the period of this exhibition, so from the 1940s to the 1970s, more or less, you know, we see a massive social and political transformation in Latin America. So this developmental project, the project of what they call import substitution, industrialization, starts to fall apart. And for multiple reasons, which we don't have to go in here. And then by the 1960s and 1970s, we get the emergence of the dictatorships, severe curtailment of freedom of expression. Some of these artists go in exile. So for example, Oiticica, who we saw before, I think he's a great way you can kind of trace the story of an artist who was part of that first utopian moment. Then because of his sexuality, his countercultural identity, he's exiled. He lives in the United Kingdom for a while, then he moves to the United States. And his work really, I wouldn't say it abandons those ideas, I would say it develops those ideas. I think there's so much, and in his writings, this is very clear, that he's still thinking about Mondrian, and he's still thinking about the utopian revolutionary potential of those works, but thinking about what it means as an exile who's taking drugs and who's experimenting, you know, with his body. So he kind of updates that, as does Lisha Papi, as do many of the artists in the show. There's a kind of second life that happens. And I think one of the things I really admire about this exhibition that you and Marita put together is the end of the show. You end with this incredible video piece by Claudio Perna and Eugenio Espinosa, where they take the grid, which is the great icon of geometry, it's the founding principle of this whole movement, and they take it out into the sand dunes and they play with it, they perform with it, they roll it up. They're sort of, in a sense, disrespecting, but also giving it a new life, and with a human body. And so I think that there is this kind of second life of reinterpretation that happens as a result of this trauma. On the question of Colombia, we're often asked this question, and obviously the exhibition reflects the collection. So the collection was very consciously put together on an axis of four specific countries: Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, not because they're the only places. Of course, there's wonderful abstraction in Mexico, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Chile, but because these are the great sort of big port cities of the Eastern Seaboard, and they were the first places to receive these movements and these ideas, and to codify them, to write about them, to create movements, you know, that had that kind of life. So it's not no collection and no exhibition is ever comprehensive. And in recent years, there's been a lot of revisionism from new scholars to look at the situation in Cuba and Colombia, you know, even in the United States, where there was also a geometric movement that was sort of covered up for a long time. And that's just, I think, a natural part of the process, that you start somewhere and then you kind of work out and see what this new canon is now covering up, and that's just normal.
We have a question from Marnie Pillsbury, who's a longtime member of the Drawings and Prints and Conservation Committees, and she's asking, when did Patty realize that the art she loved and was buying was becoming a collection? And does she miss having these beautiful pieces in her home now that she has given them to MoMA?
Well, I can't answer for Patty other than sort of secondhand, but this question of the collection is a really interesting one. And I think every collector goes through this moment. I think very few people start life saying, I'm going to be an art collector. So she tells a very funny story of being in Caracas in the garage of her house and, you know, starting to look after the works and documenting them. And then they get a phone call from a British art magazine saying, we'd like to talk to you about your collection. And saying, wait, what collection? And that question, we'd like to talk to you about your collection, what collection, is kind of the moment where I think that she and her husband really realized that they had something bigger than the sum of the parts, that there was a group of things, but that there was something that could be much bigger. And I think Gustavo's role in this is also extremely important as someone who had a vision of Latin America as a whole and could see sort of the historical connections between these nations. So I think that's at that point, which must have been in the early 80s, late 70s, fairly recently married, that I think they really decided from that point on to really consider this a collection. And does she miss it in her home? Probably.
Yeah. We have another question from Gianpaolo Francisco. He's asking, once this exhibition is over, are we going to see some of these works on display at the main galleries? And I can take this question. We are very lucky that when the museum reopens, we don't know exactly when, hopefully soon, the exhibition is gonna be still on view for a couple of months. So people have the opportunity to see Sur Moderno if they haven't yet. But once the exhibition is over, this is a great question. The works, the idea and the goal of this donation, I believe, is to integrate these works within a MoMA collection and within a larger history of art. And so, yes, these works are gonna be integrated into the collection galleries in different ways, in the different rotations of MoMA's galleries. So we are going to be able to see them again, but in different contexts, not always in their specific local or national contexts. And we also have a question by Howard Garden, who's a life trustee, who asked, did these artists think of themselves as South or South American artists or Latin American artists as compared, say, to Brazilian or Argentines? Or is that more of an importation from outside the continent?
Wow, what a great question. Thank you, Howard, for that question. It's, you know, the term Latin America is a term that was invented outside Latin America, like by definition. I've never met a single person who says I'm a Latin American. People say I'm Colombian, I'm Argentine, I'm Brazilian. So this idea that this is a one place that is just defined by sort of a line in the Rio Grande and everything south of that is one thing, I think is a very simplistic idea that was very much sort of a project of colonialism. So the answer to that question is no. I think that the sense of this being a single identity is something that is until today patently not happening. So Fernando Botero and Tomás Maldonado, they don't really have anything to do with each other, despite being from the same way that Europe covers a multitude of identities and of different histories that are often in dialogue and contradiction. But the question of geography is a really interesting one, because I think that the term that many of these artists used was sort of universalism. And so I think that there was the aspiration that you could be from a place, but you could be speaking a universal language. And that's something that you come across again and again. And there was a certain resistance. There's a beautiful text by Elio Itisica where when he was invited to Information, which is a very important show at MoMA in 1970, his text says, listen, I'm not here to represent Brazil. Like, I'm not a Brazilian artist. I'm an artist who is from Brazil. And so I think there's been a lot of times this questioning and this pushback against these kind of simplification categories. So yeah, I think it's a great question. It's very important that we keep remembering that this term Latin America, we always need to remember to put the little quotation marks around it.
Gabriel, I think little by little, we need to start wrapping up. And I wanted to ask you a final question, which is somehow a little bit more personal. And it has to do with the fact that you've worked in the Cisneros collection for more than 10 years. When you visited the museum before it closed and you saw all these works that you studied for so long installed in MoMA, what did you feel? How did you feel?
So, you know, it's bittersweet. I'd say that there's, I mean, I saw some of these works covered in dust on the floor of the artist studios, and then, you know, re-encountered them in the collection, and then, you know, today went through MoMA. So it's been an amazing journey to trace the life cycle of these pieces. And so it's bittersweet in the sense that one thing I loved about the privilege of my job was that I could touch these things and I could pick them up. And if I try and do that now, I'll be yelled at and they'll call the police. So particularly these are works that are so sensual, they're so seductive, they're so beautiful that there's something very special about being in that close proximity. So yeah, going in and seeing the guard standing next to them, it's a little difficult, but that's balanced with a sense of what I would say kind of mission accomplished. I mean, I think that the collection was very clear from the outset that this integrationist model, that, it was really that this is where those works want to be. We did it, and we did it in the donor's lifetime. And I think that is a very beautiful thing to be able to celebrate with the creation of this institute. I think and that it's not a one-off project. In 1992, there were all these one-off projects to celebrate the discovery of the Americas. MoMA today is an institution that is integrated with Latin America at every level, from the film department to architecture, kind of all over. So this really sort of marks, and it's a milestone in a much bigger story. And I think that's something to be very, to be very proud of, to be very happy about. And so this idea, and I think of these artists, to go a little bit back to Howard Gardner's question, that these were artists who felt that they were in dialogue with Mondrian, with Rodchenko, and with Max Bill. Like that was their cultural universe. That was the map of the world that they lived in. It was not a national, it was not about being Argentine. It was about engaging critically with this tradition of abstraction. So when I see these works with these, with the Rodchenko right next to the, Mirashendel or whatever the specific dialogues, I think, well, this is where they should be, So if there's one context where I think they can be better than where they were, this is the one, So it's that sense, and Patty has said it very beautifully. She has older children than we do. It's like watching your children get married, to somebody who's good. Like, it's super hard, but they're going to be in good company. So I think there's definitely that. So there's definitely that sense that this modern collection had an arc that was long and fascinating, and that this is really this handover is a very important moment. At the same time, it doesn't mean the end of the collection. There's 5 collection areas from, the Orinoco collection, where there's actually one of the baskets in the show, through colonial art, 19th century art. So right now, for example, we're working on a show of the traveler artist collection, which I'm extremely fond of. So artists from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century who traveled to Latin America and kind of made the first representations of that land. So we're working on a show with the Fine Arts Museum in Bilbao, which was supposed to open next month, but now will open next spring, curated by Estrella de Diego, who's a very distinguished Spanish art historian and curator. So it's almost like this mission accomplished. Now the exciting thing is to think about, well, what are the next underlooked areas that we can perhaps aspire to do something similar.
And there is, of course, another chapter of this donation, which is the contemporary donation that we're going to be showing in a couple of years, and we're already starting to do research on those works. So Gabriel, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This conversation has been amazing. We've learned a lot. I'm sure like all the audience is very, very happy with all your ideas and your knowledge about this. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. If everyone couldn't join, this video will be up at MoMA.org. We had viewers tune in from all over the world, Gabriel. So people were joining us from Brazil, New York, Colorado, Canada, California, Rhode Island, Mexico, Australia, Panama, Argentina, Spain, Venezuela, Florida, Pennsylvania, Uruguay, New Jersey, Illinois, Scotland, Texas, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. And I'm sure we missed a few. So thank you, all of you, for tuning in. Remember that you can stay up to date with everything that's happening at the museum on Magazine and MoMA.org, where you can also find much more information on Sur Moderno. And thanks to everyone again for tuning in. Be well, stay at home, and enjoy more virtual views from the Museum of Modern Art over the weeks ahead. We look forward to seeing you at the museum and at Sur Moderno as soon as it's possible to reopen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.